As I said in the last video, I hope this is not a rehash of something you already are very well aware of. But a lot of people, either it's been a while since they've studied any Western history, or it's been a while since they've taken a philosophy class, or maybe when they did, they didn't really, I don't know, find this particularly all that an engaging part of Western history or culture. But hopefully you'll think so, because this is really important to know. You can't understand Romanticism unless you know the Enlightenment roots of the Romantic movement. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the scientific revolution and the use of empiricism after the Restoration in England. We're talking about the period of about 1660s, somewhere around there, 1660s to 1670s. The Enlightenment in England really runs from about the 1660s up until about the late 18th century. That's the late 1700s. What's happening at that time? Well, a lot of different things are happening. I mean, it's called the Enlightenment. Sometimes this period is also called the Age of Reason. Sometimes it's called the Augustan Age. Not very often anymore. It used to be called the Augustan Age. I don't know why it was called the Augustan Age anyway, but it was often called that. It was also called the Neoclassical Age because it was a period of time when intellectuals started becoming very, very interested in everything classical, Greek and Roman, from literature, philosophy, art, even architecture. If you take a look at neoclassical buildings, Washington, D.C. is strewn with them, right? Columns and domes and all of the arches and those kinds of architectural features that you would find on the Acropolis or in Rome, for example, in ancient Rome or ancient Greece. So, but we're going to call it the Enlightenment simply because I'm more interested in intellectual history than I am in some of the other kind of associations that some people have with this particular era. Begin with the scientific revolution. Up there in the top there, you've got a couple of guys there, Isaac Newton and John Locke, and they're very important fellows. There are many others that we don't have time to talk about. I'm going to kind of rip through this pretty quickly. What happens, though, I want to talk about a guy named Francis Bacon, who, in the Advancement of Learning and Novum Organum and different works back in the earlier part of the 1600s, started essentially what's called the scientific method. Okay, eons ago, back in ancient Greece, Aristotle advocated deductive reasoning, and you use the syllogism when you deal with deductive reasoning. You're going from things that are known and applying things that are known to things that are unknown, okay? Or another way to put it is you go from universals to particulars, okay? This is universally known. Here's a particular instance of it. Apply what's universally known to this particular instance. Therefore, you get something. It's called a syllogism. You can kind of go back and kind of take a look at that and refresh yourself a little bit on it. The reason Bacon is so important is he developed what is considered to be the forerunner of the scientific method, which is to say we're not going to assume anything about universal principles of this, universal principles of that, until we go out and observe individual instances of a thing. So I'm not going to just assume that something is true because Aristotle told me or we learned about it years ago, etc., and then we're just going to apply that universally received truth to a particular instance. Instead, I'm going to go out and observe all the instances, observe all the data. Go at this without any preconceived notions, and when I've observed enough data, when I've observed enough instances, when I've done a big enough sample, then I'm going to draw my universal general conclusion based on it. So there's a hypothesis, there's a methodology, and then there's a conclusion. So this is all, to us, this is old hat. This is how you conduct an experiment. This is how you do something. This is how you do research in the social sciences or the natural sciences. But at the time, it was a really, really big deal because it was the idea of we're not going to simply accept what the ancients said is true, okay? There's a rather apocryphal story of, I don't know, Galileo getting up on the top of a tower and shoving off a feather and a rock, and they both land at the same time on the ground, and the crowd is astonished because Aristotle says that heavy things fall faster than lighter things, and so on and so forth. I don't know how true that story is, but it's a good example anyway of how people like Galileo were simply not going to accept what they were told to accept as being truths about the natural universe and these kinds of things, and instead wanted to go in and conduct what we would call experiments to find that out. So it's a different way of acquiring knowledge. It's a way of acquiring knowledge that says I'm going to trust my own observation capabilities and not the word of somebody from hundreds or even thousands of years ago. Now, why is that important? The second big thing the reason that's important with the Enlightenment is this. As a result of this, and you get everything from the Royal Academy being developed where people are conducting these experiments and trying these things out and doing these observations. And they're writing back and forth to each other. They're meeting. They're even starting things that we would call the forerunners of scientific journals or scholarly journals, where they're publishing things and writing for each other, and they're reading about it and trying to replicate these kinds of things back and forth. Franklin did that, for example, quite a bit. He was an avid reader of what was going on in Europe in the scientific community, and always wanted to try things out and see whether they worked from his own experiences. So what's happening is we're morphing into a world, in the Enlightenment anyway, where people are looking at the universe as more of an understandable place, not the mysterious place that of the medieval world or the Renaissance, where things were a great mystery, and why do tsunamis happen, and why do volcanoes happen, and they just happen because God's mad, or they just happen because it's the fate or whatever. That there have to be explainable, understandable reasons for things happening in the universe. That the universe then at the Enlightenment begins to embrace the notion that the universe is governed by principles, laws, and reason, and if we can just figure out what those laws and those principles are, if we can just use our reason, then the world, the universe, our existence here on this planet can be something that is improved, that the quality of our life can be improved. Why didn't they do that during the medieval period? Well, for a couple of different reasons. One, part of it was church teaching that what was really important isn't this life, it's the next life. Okay, life was really short in the medieval period. You didn't have a lot of time. I mean, why bother to go about improving this life? You're not going to be here that long, for heaven's sakes. But it was just a very different shift. The notion that the world is an understandable place leads very logically to the idea that we can understand the causes of things like diseases, natural disasters. We can create societies, structures, infrastructures within our cities, for example, that make life more comfortable, more healthy, more enjoyable, more prosperous, that promote greater understanding. All of these kinds of things. That's why it's called the Enlightenment. I mean, it was a huge leap forward in the way people thought about existence on this planet. There was also concomitant with that a desire to apply reason to practices in science, right, obviously, but also politics. This is where the American Revolution, the ideological origins of the American Revolution, are grounded thoroughly in Enlightenment thinking. The idea that why in the world should we allow government to be something that's left up to primogeniture? Some bucktooth idiot over there in England has a kid, and that kid's first in line, therefore that bucktooth idiot's kid gets to be the next bucktooth idiot ruler. I mean, it's a dumb idea, right? So people begin, especially around the American Revolution, that time, start to be thinking, why couldn't we fashion a government, make one, right? Not just inherit it, but make one. And if we made one, what would it look like? Well, it need to contain certain principles and certain laws, certain tenets, certain procedures that make sense, you see, that would foster the general welfare, promote the general welfare, and advance the blessings of liberty, etc., etc., etc. They're also applying this idea of reason to religion. We're especially going to see that in the next couple of lessons as we look at how Puritanism morphed to Congregationalism, and Congregationalism morphed eventually, some of it, to Unitarianism, and Unitarianism, some of it morphed even to something as radical as Transcendentalism, the idea of trying to apply reason to these kinds of things. Another thing you'll see in Enlightenment things, in the Enlightenment period, is this mimetic idea of art. We get the word mime or mimic from mimetic, and it means imitating. So the standard for the nature, value, function of art during the Enlightenment period was, in other words, art was good to the extent that it accurately imitated nature, right? So the Enlightenment wasn't looking for art to teach us moral lessons. It wasn't looking for us it wasn't looking for art to be some sort of vehicle for the personal self-expression of the writer. That's going to be Romanticism. Instead, the Enlightenment period is all about art needs to imitate life. It needs to be an accurate depiction or representation of life as we see it and as we know it. Now, a final couple of things that are really important. I hate to give it so little shrift, but it's very important. You need to think about this, because this is where the American Revolution and everything else that happens in the Enlightenment really kind of comes into play. When you think about Newtonian physics, all right, and you think about Newton as a guy who is striving mightily to make the universe a more understandable place, to say, here are some regular, some predictable, some demonstrable things that govern the universe. We call them laws of physics, even though a modern physicist would kind of chuckle at the idea of the laws of physics, okay? But it is an attempt to say there is a regularity of events and sequences and phenomena in the universe, okay? So therefore it is understandable, and all the more important, it is predictable. Okay, that it is mathematical, it is predictable, it is something that we can actually count on happening in a certain way. We can't always predict what's going to happen, but we can explain why it did anyway in a scientific manner. You combine that with a fellow up in the right hand portion of your screen named John Locke, who in his work Essay Concerning Human Understanding makes this argument about human cognition, about human learning, as a philosopher dealing in the field of epistemology. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that deals with how do we know things and how do we learn things and what can we know and what can't we know, etc. Locke comes up with this fabulous little theory that he calls tabula rasa, and tabula rasa simply means blank slate. And what he says is essentially all of our knowledge comes from a lifetime of experiences. And those experiences come to us through our senses: taste, touch, sight, smell, hearing, etc. All that kind of stuff, right? But we're all born with kind of a blank slate. We're like a DVD, an empty DVD or CD or what have you, an empty flash drive. There's nothing on it. We're just programmed and ready to receive stuff. And who we are depends on the experiences we have. Now that's a really important revolutionary thing. Many of us would say, oh well, so what? What's the big deal? That seems pretty obvious. But it's not obvious to the 17th and 18th century mind. It's radical and revolutionary in terms of, you aren't just born smart, you aren't just born talented, right? They thought it might be breeding or whatever. And more importantly, it's revolutionary because if you buy the idea of tabula rasa, what you've really done is you've totally undercut at the knees the idea of aristocracy. Because if you look at Prince Charles or Prince William or whatever, and you say, well, why is that guy so much more educated? Why is he fluent in French? Why does he have better manners and better graces? And why has he behaved the way? Because of the experiences he had. He grew up with that environment, therefore he was acculturated to it. He was trained to do it. He experienced those things. If you gave everyone those kinds of experiences, what would we have? We would have a nation, a society, a civilization filled with people who also were intelligent and educated and enlightened and with good taste and good manners and all this kind of stuff. In other words, there really isn't any argument for aristocracy or even class structure at that stage. Instead, what tabula rasa implies is what we ought to do is get busy getting everybody the same level of experiences, the same opportunities, the same education, the same background, the same skills, because if we did that, we wouldn't be wasting 99% of human capacity and capabilities. And so it's revolutionary. When people begin to say to themselves, the only reason that guy in that very expensive horse and carriage with that ermine coat and that crown on his head is where he is because of a luck or accident of birth, and he seems smarter than me that's because he was able to go to schools I wasn't able to go to. Anybody else gets an opportunity like that, who knows what they might be able to do? Maybe they'll end up smarter than him, maybe they'll work harder than him, and so on and so forth. So it's the basis for a complete cultural but also political revolution. It's also the basis of a notion, for the first time in human history, in the Western world anyway, of progress. 1500s, if you'd said the word progress, people would not have known what you meant. They would say, what are you talking about? Because they saw the world as basically static. True, technology changes a little bit, right? Ships are bigger, or cannons, or gunpowder, or whatnot. But they had a very, very sort of glacial view of human history moving forward. And they didn't really believe that human beings were able to be better. Their toys could get better, but they couldn't get better. That class structures would stay the same. Human beings morally and intellectually will always roughly be the same. But this is an optimistic era. This is an era that stresses the rights and potential of the individual. This is very important. It gives birth to the American Revolution. In an almost nightmarish fashion, it gives birth to the French Revolution as well, which we'll see a little bit later on. The French Revolution is this interesting mix or amalgam of the Enlightenment and the early Romantic period as well, and it doesn't go so well. But I want you to keep all these things in mind because we're going to transition on in to Romanticism and what its basic tenets are, but you have to bear these ideas of the Enlightenment in mind because you won't get a full, complete picture of why Romanticism is so important and why it believes why people believed what they did and behaved the way they did unless you know where it came from.